I bring greetings from the Republic of Trumpistan. The People's Republic, I should add. It's a pleasure to be here, and I think on behalf of my other North American colleagues, we're so happy to be here with all of our friends from New Zealand, and that's the other country, Australia, here in this part of the world. So it is a real delight, and to meet our soulmates as well. The colleagues have their bios in the program, so I won't go into great detail, but just a little bit of context setting. Those of you who follow American politics, and in this day and age, who can't, with the greatest entertainer on earth in the center ring, what we've been seeing in the U.S. is really quite remarkable. And in my opinion, there's a sea change in American politics, and it is generally not for the good. The increasing polarization, which had been going on for some years, the Pew Charitable Trust research survey in 2014 showed the highest degree of political polarization since the last 30 years in the United States, as measured by things such as, do you have friends who don't share your political view? Do you watch television shows or read magazines with alternative views and so on? And those numbers all indicated that something dramatic was happening, and again, I think not a happy outcome overall. The rise of populism, a topic I'll be talking about directly, has been shown very directly in American politics. Jan Werner Müller's definition of populism as the political theory that says there's the authentic, true people and the others. That is really the key. We see it on the left and on the right. It comes in two different flavors. Donald Trump, a great political philosopher, articulated it perfectly in May of 2016 in an offhand comment. He gave the best statement of populism I have ever heard. If somebody doesn't want to endorse, I don't want their endorsement. The only important thing is the unification of the people, because the other people don't mean anything. So just think about that for a moment, what that means for politics. The unification of the people, because the other people don't mean anything. Now we've heard that on the left for years. The people united cannot be defeated, which means anyone who opposes us is not the people. So we've become accustomed to that, but now we've heard that in a strident form on the right. And on the left, Mrs. Clinton responded in a like form. As she stated on television, one of those lines that may have lost her the election, she said, just to be grossly generalistic, you could put half of Trump supporters in what I call the basket of deplorables, right? They're racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. And she goes on, they are irredeemable. They are not America. So that's half of her opponent's supporters. What about the other half? They're desperate people, desperate for change. It doesn't really matter even where it comes from. They don't buy everything he says, but he seems to hold out some hope that their lives will be different. They won't wake up and see their jobs disappear, lose a kid to heroin, feel like they're in a dead end. Those are people we have to understand and empathize with as well. So the two categories on the other side were evil people and losers. This is not an effective outreach strategy to bring people over to your side. It may have been one of the moments when she lost the election of so many. We're heading into midterm elections, and just to put it in context, it is normal for the party that holds the presidency to lose seats in the House of Representatives in these midterm elections. So if there's a loss, don't be totally shocked. But it could mean, because the president's approval rating is fairly low, it just bounced up, but it's below 50%, and it is normal when the president's approval rating is below 50%, they suffer massive losses in the House.
It's actually higher than Obama's was at this point.
Okay. I'm looking at the 30-year averages. When it is below 50%, the loss on average over 30 years is 26 seats, and on average, since 2007, it's 33 seats. All they need is 24 seats to flip, and they lose control of the House. And that could mean a big change again in American politics. So these things bear watching. Now, with their views on this, I'm going to turn to my colleagues, and you can Would you wish to be seated, or would you like to come up here, Ilya?
For the video, please, at the lectern. Okay.
Okay.
There you go.
Ilya Shapiro is a colleague at the Cato Institute. He is a master of the amicus curiae, filing friend of the court briefs in case after case after case, and I'm happy to say racking up quite a number of impressive victories. Ilya.
Well, thanks for that, Tom. And indeed, as Tom got into, the strongest argument for voting for Hillary Clinton was that Donald Trump was her opponent, and the strongest argument for voting for Donald Trump was that Hillary Clinton was her opponent. It was an odd election in that sense, probably the two worst candidates we've ever had in American history running against each other. I'm also kind of behind the eight ball here, following a sex therapist. I'm sorry to, I know this is going to be a letdown for those of you in this room. I'm also dismayed that this panel takes place early in the morning, because typically I like the evening panels when people have something, some adult beverages. I find that the more my audience has had to drink, the wittier I am. But nevertheless, I want to talk to you. My little slice of U.S. politics is the importance of the Supreme Court and judicial nominations to the American political landscape. This is quite different from most countries. We legal pundits jump up and down every 4 years and want voters to pay attention to judicial nominations because it is really important. But in 2016, they finally listened. It's kind of like the dog that finally caught the car. 53% of Trump voters found that the Supreme Court, and especially the vacancy that was left by Antonin Scalia's death in February of an election year, was extremely important, compared to only 44% of Clinton voters. And of those for whom it was the number one issue, that's about 21% of the electorate, Trump won that body 56-44. So I think it's pretty safe to say that if Scalia had not died, I'm not sure whether Trump would have won. I mean, this was not, I'm not exaggerating, I'm not elevating my own issue area above others, but this was a unique circumstance. And I'm not just talking about keeping together the traditional Republican Party coalition, the evangelicals and the legal elites and conservatives. Even Rust Belt voters, those swing voters in the states of Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, Iowa, the ones that Trump took over, that Obama had won twice, that, there's some of those states no Republican had won, I think, since either 84 or 88 with the Reagan-Bush elections. And these are folks, a lot of whom aren't the most, don't have college university degrees, but still very aware of these legal issues. And it's not abortion or gay marriage, as a lot of people might think. It's kind of the understanding that certain kinds of judges are more respective of their cultures, whether that be religious liberty or gun rights or anything else. I'm reading a great book right now called The Great Revolt, which is by Selena Zito, who's a notable reporter now with the Washington Examiner, I believe, along with Brad Todd. They authored this book. It's kind of an autopsy of the Trump voters in those swing Rust Belt states. And not only do you get kind of these general themes that we've all heard about the Reagan Democrats and the working class voters, including many counties that flipped, that voted for Obama twice and now went to Trump. That seems strange at first, but when you read their stories, it's quite remarkable. There was I was just reading last night, there was a farmer, I think in Iowa, or maybe a small businessman in this small Iowa county, did not have a university degree. He's older, in his 60s. But he talked not just about the importance of judges in that pivotal Supreme Court vote, but he made a comment to the effect that, well, Elena Kagan and Soto Sotomayor, they're no Bill Brennan or Thurgood Marshall. I mean, this is graduate degree level of analysis of American judging, really. The average, millennial working away at his laptop at a Starbucks in Washington, D.C. wouldn't know some of those names. And here's a man who epitomized, again, why Trump won in those states. And this shouldn't be that surprising, really, when you think about it, because a president has few constitutional powers, certainly in the domestic sphere in America, more important than federal judicial nominations. Legislative victories can be short-lived. Budget reform sunset, regulations can be rescinded. Executive actions, as we've seen, aren't worth the pen and phone that they're written on or called in with. But federal judicial appointments are for life. Justice Scalia was Ronald Reagan's bridge to the 21st century. 2 years ago, there was a very important ruling by a federal district judge, that's a trial level in California, regarding nonprofit donor disclosures, an issue very important to many in this room, certainly to the Cato Institute. This was made by a judge who was appointed by Lyndon Johnson. I mean, some of you in this room, you students, that's the same as talking about, the Civil War or the founding of Australia or something like that. This is ancient, but the dead hand is there long after the occupant of the White House has departed. And like I said, in the 2016 election, the vacant seat crystallized the issue for a big chunk of voters. These voters knew they were not voting simply for a president whom they may have found distasteful, and this comes out a lot in this book that I mentioned, The Great Revolt, but also weighing the balance of the court for a long, long time. And the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, made sure of that by announcing his controversial decision not to take up any replacements for Justice Scalia during the election campaign. This was a very controversial position, but ultimately redounded to the political benefit of the Republicans. In fact, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, who reviews judicial nominations, was from Iowa, which is supposed to be a swing state. Even though millions of dollars were spent by independent interest groups trying to defeat him on this issue of the appointment of Merrick Garland, President Obama's nominee, he won by 25 points. I think this was his 7th term or something, but it's his his second best electoral win. The voters judged that Trump's fabulous list of terrific judges, right? You're going to love these judges. They're just the best. They were. The list that he put out, I must say, I don't know if you recall this part of the campaign, but about 2 years ago, Trump put out this list of would-be, among whom he'd be choosing his candidate for the Supreme Court, which was a tremendously unorthodox move. I mean, defying all conventional political wisdom. Typically, you don't put out such lists for cabinet members, judges, whatever, because that paints a target on their back, and the media will start attacking them. The opposition party will dig up negative things about them and things like that. But this helped keep together that coalition, this dynamic that I described. Once he put out that list, that made it so that he could even survive the leak of that Access Hollywood video about his various boorish behavior. And people judged that they would rather have people from that list than whomever they could expect from Hillary Clinton. So all the harping about Justice Gorsuch being an illegitimate justice is sour grapes tied into general complaints about the elections. The Russians preventing Hillary Clinton from campaigning in Wisconsin and writing her basket of deplorables speech, all of that stuff, right? And Trump at least had the wisdom of deferring to a judicial nominations team that's continued creating exceptional lists of judges and appointing people, and deferring to my friends at the Federalist Society and the White House counsel's office, who obviously know much more about this. Trump doesn't know originalism from origami, but I only wish that he would let the Federalist Society run the rest of the government. I mean, it would be fantastic. Because these judicial slots were real wild cards, and if a constitutional lawyer who'd been president of the Harvard Law Review, Obama, deprioritized judicial nominations, he made relatively few his first term, especially the first year, then how much would a celebrity real estate developer care? Would Trump see these as patronage posts for his casino lawyers and others that he encountered in the entertainment world? And it turns out, no, this has been probably Trump's biggest success, and to the extent that he minimizes losses in the midterms, especially in the Senate, which, as I said, are the ones that review and confirm judges, then this will again play a big role. If you would have predicted the record number of circuit confirmations, that's the federal appellate level. He set a record of 12 in the first year, and now we're all the way up to 21, which is remarkable. And this administration has surpassed even George W. Bush's well-oiled machine for selecting committed and youthful originalists and textualists and getting them through the Senate. But really, the reason why this plays such an important role is two things. First, the escalation of political toxicity. I don't see what that yellow sign in the back says. Do I have like 2 minutes, 1 minute, 5 minutes? Are you protesting me? 2 minutes. Okay, good, good, good. So I don't know how much you all know about American political history in this area, but we had the borking of Robert Bork in the mid-'80s, where this very conservative candidate was demagogued effectively. And then Clarence Thomas had a difficulty getting through the Senate, although he was eventually confirmed 58-42. Note that if the Democrats had filibustered, they could have prevented Clarence Thomas from getting on the bench. Then Bush judges were filibustered. For the first time, Harry Reid, the Democratic leader, used partisan filibusters to stop judges. 10 years later, he exercised the nuclear option when he was in the majority to get rid of filibusters and confirm a lot of judges. And then we had the Garland blockade and the Gorsuch denouement. But really, this all comes down to the convergence of three trends. We have different conceptions of the judicial role, different legal theories that are farther and farther apart regarding how you interpret statutes and the Constitution. And these increasingly track party identification. And the parties themselves are more ideologically coherent than I think they've ever been. There's the Conservative Party and the Progressive Party. That's not the norm in America, but that's our new normal. At least, who knows what will happen after this populist moment, but that's what we have for the time being. So of course, judicial nominations are going to be fraught. If every June the Supreme Court decides 5 or 6 of the major political issues in American life, then those nominations, and the lower courts, because the lower courts decide 50,000 cases a year, that's going to be huge. It's a big deal, and so I don't blame the senators for politicizing the issue. It's the way the system dynamics works, and that goes back to the Supreme Court itself being at fault, going back to the 30s and 40s, for engaging in constitutional corruption and making constitutional law ever more different from the Constitution itself. And so, if we're not observing federalism and the separation of powers, these structural checks on the American political scene, then of course voters are going to go in for what they see as the policy result they want and the partisan affiliation of the judges that they see. It's not a healthy thing, but it is what it is. Thanks.
Next presenter, Dara Lind, is a reporter with Vox News. That's Vox, not Fox News. She's best known for her work on immigration, which, as you know, has come to be a central issue in American political debate.
Thank you, Dr. Palmer, and thanks to all of you and to the conference for having me. While I'd love to be able to talk about immigration for 12 minutes here, and I'd love to be able to work on immigration all day, every day, the problem with being a reporter in DC for a relatively not huge website in the Trump era is that the president tweets things often. And the fact of the matter is that what the daily life of DC is actually concerned with is not primarily what is the sort of rarefied world that Mr. Shapiro lives in, and that I envy a great deal, where they're thinking about things that actually matter and are going to shape the course of American jurisprudence and politics for generations to come. But the ongoing effort to figure out what the president just said, whether he meant it, and whether it's going to lead to anything. Which is, I'm not just here to kvetch, I'm here to kvetch a little bit. I figure it's, useful color for those of you who follow American politics from abroad, but it's a great problem for figuring out what is going on in the government when, and it feeds into the kind of broader dynamic that Dr. Palmer mentioned in his opening remarks, but that I think Mr. Shapiro actually put really well when he was talking about the feeling that certain judges are more respectful of voters' culture as an important reason to vote for a particular party, which, if you think about it, is not actually about jurisprudence at all. It's about the role in an ongoing culture war that the two parties, and particularly, the president as the culture warrior in chief, culture commander in chief, I suppose, have taken in their symbolic roles in American life, which as often as not obscure and distort the actual scope of the policy debates and the things that are happening in Donald Trump's Washington, with or without the cognizance of Trump himself. So whenever there's a new tweet or a new offhand remark at a roundtable or something like that, the first priority is usually to just figure out at the basic level what is being referred to. There are people who literally have the job of trying to sync up that morning's Fox News broadcast with the president's tweets and figure out whether he's watching Fox and Friends on what he calls a super DVR tape delay or whether he's watching it live. But after that, it's a process of figuring out whether it actually matters or not. I often see a new tweet from the president or some kind of remark and go, okay, the president made some mouth noises today. Because the fact of the matter is that not everything the president says is a policy statement. And quite often, the things that he says are either trial balloons that will be swiftly dismissed if they don't go over particularly well with their intended audience, or just off-the-cuff remarks that no one in the White House had seriously been contemplating up to that point. And of those, about 50% of the time, the White House scrambles into gear and rushes to produce fact sheets for whatever the president's new fixation is, and the other 50% of the time, they just quietly let the issue die. That's not, it honest to goodness screws with salience processing. For me as a reporter, because my job is literally to sift the signal from the noise and to tell people who don't have the luxury of following politics all day, every day, what is actually important and what is going to change in their lives. And for anyone who's actually involved in the policy making of Washington, for whom the political dynamics of an issue can change radically because they counted on the president to be in their corner and he wasn't. When the president ended the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals immigration program in September, which had been instituted by President Obama to give people who had come to the US as children and didn't have papers and had been in the US for a certain amount of time and had had met educational requirements, et cetera, to give them temporary protection from deportation. When Trump tried to end that program, which is now caught up in litigation, speaking to Ilya's point about the importance of the judicial branch, he bent over backwards to say that the people who were being affected shouldn't worry because Congress would work something out, which led a lot of people, both in Congress and outside Congress, to assume that the president was going to throw his weight around and push for whatever bill bipartisan groups of legislators could come up with. That didn't happen at all. Figures in the White House developed a very long wish list of policies that they wanted to see included, didn't tell anybody what their which among those several pages of policies were their biggest priorities or their deal breakers, and ultimately led to a situation where the president, on at least 2 occasions, agreed in principle to a deal verbally and then backed away, which makes it extremely difficult to not only get policy done, but to even understand going into a policy battle what the fights you have to win are, because you can't necessarily tell who has the president's ear at any given time. This gets into the other kind of, the 3-ring circle metaphor is actually quite apt, because in one ring you have the president himself. In a second you have the ongoing soap opera of figures within the White House, the biggest plot in which is obviously the Mueller-Russia investigation, but which also has various subplots involving the president's tensions with various of his own political appointees, hiring and firing, et cetera. It's very easy to write that off as gossip because usually it doesn't actually matter who the president is mad at any given day, or, whether he's which of his friends he's calling on his own personal unsecured phone when he, goes up in his room for executive time. This all very easily seems like just so much DC superficial, pseudo page 6 gossip rag. The problem is that because the president is known for being easily swayed by the last person who talked to him, knowing who the last person who talked to him was actually becomes extremely important. When John Kelly was appointed chief of staff last year, a lot of people who had not been following Chief of Staff Kelly's performance as Secretary of Homeland Security assumed that he was going to be a, top-down stabilizing force who wasn't going to put his oar in on policy at all. That was not the case. And knowing that he was as much of a law and order hawk as Trump had appeared to be on the campaign trail actually made it much easier to figure out what the president was going to be doing during that immigration debate, because it was known that the person who was controlling the president's schedule had certain policies that he wanted the president to pursue. It's not very easy to talk about policy when you have to start by talking about the various personalities of figures within the White House. I don't consider myself a political reporter. I'm not one of the many outlets who gets text messages from White House sources on the regular festooned with emojis to talk about just how bad things are. But what I am is a reporter who works on one of the issues where the Trump administration is actually changing a great deal of things very radically and very rapidly. Not only is the Department of Homeland Security on a bunch of different fronts working to slow legal immigration, to more thoroughly vet or just reject visa applications, refugee processing, but the Department of Justice under Attorney General Jeff Sessions is reorienting itself toward immigration enforcement in a way we haven't seen before, and in a very effective way. Sessions is not only litigating much of the stuff that it is going through the courts, as Ilya talked about, but he's trying to reorient the department's resources so that illegal entry and reentry, which are already the most prosecuted crimes in the federal system, are now being prosecuted are in theory going to be prosecuted at 100%, whereas they're now at 10%, which would be a radical reorientation of massive resources toward a particular variety of crime. But nobody talks about Jeff Sessions' work on immigration in Washington. When they talk about Jeff Sessions, they talk about the fact that Donald Trump is mad at him because Jeff Sessions said no to Donald Trump on exactly one occasion, and Donald Trump has never forgiven him, which means that Sessions, who's actually doing more than arguably anyone else to pursue Trumpism as an ideology within the federal government, is being attacked on the right by fans of the president and being, in some cases perversely lauded on the left by people who think of him as the avatar of an independent Department of Justice. That is weird. It is totally divorced from policy, and it gives us a distorted sense of the fact that things really are happening in this administration. To the credit of some people in Washington, Congress is not doing this a humongous amount. They've actually been, as much as Congress is responsible for political polarization and as little as they often want to do any legislating, the Republican majority kept its head down pretty well on healthcare and tax reform in the first year, and Democrats in Congress have been known to complain that they can't get on television to talk about issues because the only thing that television producers want them to talk about is the Russia scandal. But the administration itself has been known to see the kind of ongoing culture war of the president saying things that make people upset as an advantage for them. That's why they pressed on when President Trump referred to some people as animals last week, turned it into a massive, fact sheet and press push and all of that. That's why the president keeps talking about whether people kneel for the national anthem at NFL games or not. These aren't issues that anyone thinks the federal government should be solving. They're not policy issues in any meaningful sense. They are issues that a lot of Americans on both sides think of as important issues for the nation to address, right? Like, that's not necessarily wrong. It's not wrong to think that there needs to be a national conversation about whether the feeling of being marginalized is, something that needs to be accommodated by other people who may not agree with you. And that's something that's true of people on both right and left. There is a good conversation to be had about whether if talking about the personal obstacles that you've experienced turns you into a victim and divorces you from your own agency. These are very important national issues, but they're being channeled through the federal government, which is not actually an organ that literally anyone on left or right thinks is the right way to address them. So we're having what's essentially a beauty pageant. The idea of Donald Trump being in the Oval Office as a representative of the people he catered to during the campaign, the people who support him, their feeling of being empowered because their kind of guy is in office, and the other side's feeling of being disempowered because the other side's guy is fine for a head of state, but Donald Trump isn't just head of state, he's head of government. And so the world where things are actually changing for people for immigrants and their families, for example, for the people who are working in the healthcare industry, where the various threatened regulatory changes and actual regulatory changes and legislation are changing pretty rapidly on a regular basis, are being obscured. And the people considered victims are the ones who are just kind of participating in politics as fans.
Our final speaker is someone I've known for more than a few years. Professor Jim Lark is professor of applied mathematics and engineering at the University of Virginia and has been involved with explicit upfront libertarian organizations for at least a few years. Yes. And I should point out, after he's done, it's my understanding that questions can be put into the app, and we'll be able then to have a robust conversation. Jim.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor to have the opportunity to address you. It's also a great honor to have the opportunity to meet Ms. Lind and Mr. Shapiro, people whose work I've followed, and I finally have the opportunity to see them in the flesh. In trying to decide what to discuss today, I thought it might be interesting to talk about the role of third-party and independent candidates in the United States. When I had the opportunity to address libertarians, the Libertarian Party in New Zealand in 2009, one of the things that struck me as very interesting was they had no concept of what the American political system was like, in that they had no idea of just how hard it was for the Libertarian Party in the United States to gain some sort of traction. So I think you might find this interesting, and I'll keep my remarks short, some of you might say mercifully short, so that we can have some time for questions. As was noted, there are many people in the United States, I dare say a majority, perhaps even a vast majority of people, who felt that the two major party presidential candidates in 2016 were the worst candidates in the history of sapient life on our planet. And thus, there was a cry among many for a third-party alternative or an independent candidate who could come forward and be a candidate for whom people could actually vote for. There are many people who vote against, and I think if one is scrupulously honest, many of those who voted in the 2016 presidential election and many other elections would tell you it's not so much that I voted for him or her, I voted against her or him. And so in looking at the political situation in the United States, one might say, well, is there a cry for a third party? Will we see a third or fourth or other parties? And the answer is perhaps. It's possible. There is evidence that there is a demand among many people in the United States for a third party. There are various polling data that suggest that, say, roughly 60% of the American electorate do want to see a viable third option. Now, of course, if you ask me, do I want the newest Aston Martin to come off the line, the answer is yes. If you ask me, am I willing to pay list price, the answer is no. So the fact that many people express a desire for a third party doesn't mean that they would actually support such a party, but they would actually like to see some political competition. However, in the United States, unlike other countries in the world, or at least unlike some countries in the world, it is very difficult for third party or independent candidates to gain traction, and there are a variety of reasons for that. The first one is that the Democrats and Republicans, representatives of the legacy, they make the rules for everyone else. And I'll give you a hint. They don't always play fair. I can see the look of shock on your face. We also have a system of basically single-member plurality districts, first past the post voting. It is possible for people to be elected with totals under a majority of the electorate. And indeed, that happens not infrequently in the United States. We also have a situation where ballot access laws make it very difficult for third-party and independent candidates to gain the ballot. I will start off with a rumor. I don't know if this is true. It's plausible, but I don't know if it's true. In 1992, Ross Perot ran for president as an independent candidate. He actually gained a fairly substantial share of the vote. He was doing very well in terms of his media attention. It has been suggested to me that when Mr. Perot was deciding that he wanted to run, his first option actually was to find someone, perhaps a United States senator, who actually represented his views. However, the nature of ballot access laws in the United States would have made it essentially impossible for him to run a serious campaign. Why? Because it's simply so damn difficult to get on the ballot in the United States unless you are incredibly wealthy. And because of campaign finance laws, which basically limit the amount of money that you can give to support candidates, he found, or at least the story is, that he found the only way he was going to be able to put someone in the national spotlight, someone who could represent his perspective, was to run himself. Now again, I don't know if that story's true, but it certainly makes sense. In my state, the state of Virginia, I'm a Virginia hillbilly by both birth and conviction, and I've done a lot of work actually going out and handing clipboards to complete strangers, asking them to sign a petition where they have to give their name and address. They don't have to give their social security number, but it's listed on the form. Would you please give us your social security number? It's optional, but it's right there. I'm asking them to sign a piece of paper to put someone on the ballot. In most cases, they've never heard of that someone. Now, in the state of Virginia, we have to get 10,000 signatures to, say, place the presidential candidate on the ballot. Now, you would say 10,000 signatures. That's not hard. Go out and do it. If you want to try to, by the way, if you ever come to the United States, if you want to learn about how the American people view politics in the United States, go out and petition for a third party or independent candidate of whom no one has heard. You will find out an awful lot about politics in the United States. One thing that you'll find out is how ignorant most Americans are of politics. Because in many cases you have to gather the signatures by congressional district. Well, they don't know their congressional district. Sir, ma'am, who's your congressperson? Oh, I don't know. Do you have, do you have any idea what's going on? By the way, this is not class-based. You will find, interestingly enough, that people who are very, very wealthy, in many cases, have no clue who their congressperson is. They just know it's someone, maybe they don't like that person very much. But simply getting on the ballot is extremely difficult. In 2016, it cost the Libertarian Party of Virginia about $30,000 just to get our candidate on the ballot. We paid for that ourselves, and we don't have a lot of money. To place a candidate on the ballot in Oklahoma, we finally were able to place our candidate, Governor Johnson, on the ballot in 2016 in the ballot in Oklahoma. It cost us about $105,000 just to get his name on the ballot. Now, if you are an extremely wealthy party, $105,000 is not a lot. If you're a party such as the Libertarian Party, that's a lot of money. And that's just to get on the ballot. We also have things such as submission laws that, for example, if you wish to submit your signatures, in some states you have to submit them all at one time. You're probably saying, well, why does that make a difference? Well, the worst thing you can do if you're trying to put a candidate on the ballot is to miss it by that much. So what you end up doing is you spend an enormous amount of time, effort, and resources to make sure you don't miss it by this much. You also have situations where it is very difficult for organizations actually to become political parties. In the Commonwealth of Virginia, there are only two political parties, Democrats and Republicans. To be a recognized political party in the Commonwealth of Virginia, you have to have, among other characteristics, you have to have a candidate who received at least 10% of the vote in one of the two most recent statewide general elections. It makes it extremely hard for a third party or an independent candidate just to get on the blasted ballot. I mentioned campaign finance laws. It is extremely expensive. If you wish to put together an effort to proselytize for your point of view through the political system, again, the cost for a new party in this country to have anywhere like a fighting chance of getting its message to a large fraction of the American electorate is at least $10 million. That's a ballpark estimate, but I think it's pretty accurate. We also have things, by the way, like filing deadlines, early filing deadlines, and sore loser laws. If you run, say, as a Republican in a primary, and you lose the primary, you cannot then run as an independent on the election ballot. So there are many institutional reasons that keep third party and independent candidates off the ballot. It makes it very difficult for people who wish to step forward. In many cases, out of the best sense of civic responsibility, they wish to offer a perspective, a view, a philosophy to the electorate. It is very difficult for them to have that opportunity. We also have a phenomenon, and this is just a personal bitch, because many of the news organizations treat elections as horse races as opposed to discussions of substantive issues. And thus, any third party or independent candidate is very much looked at as an interloper. By the way, we have lots and lots of interesting discussions about why news organizations do not invite third party and independent candidates to their debates. And we can discuss that in terms of the question period. With respect to the particular organization I represent, the Libertarian Party, we also have some interesting problems, one of which is, frankly, the American people don't really agree with us that much, and we have a long way to go before we have convinced them that perhaps we should be put in positions of responsibility. We also find that many third-party and independent organizations basically are made up of people who frankly don't like politics. They get together for the purpose of trying to put forward a vision that their fellow citizens can embrace, but they don't like politics. And most of us who are involved in third-party efforts, we're amateurs playing in a professional's game, and the professionals are very good. They are very well paid, and they're mean. They like to win, they really hate to lose. So I think with that, I could go on for several hours and bore you to tears. I think the best thing to do, since you've got good people of whom you can ask questions, and I'm here for comic relief, I think what we should do is open it up for questions at this time.
Are you saying I'm not funny?
No, that's not what I'm saying.